No one understood why a healthy German shepherd would choose to sleep in the bitter Montana snow. Mason Fletcher first noticed it on a Tuesday morning, Ranger curled up outside his custom-built, insulated doghouse while frost gathered on his thick fur. By day 3, Mason's concern had turned to dread. "What the hell's gotten into you, boy?" he whispered, watching his loyal companion through frosted windows. That night, as temperatures plummeted to 17 below, Mason saw Ranger rise periodically to shake off accumulating snow before settling back into the same vigilant position, eyes fixed on the doghouse entrance. When Mason approached, Ranger, a dog who'd faced gunfire without flinching, bared his teeth and issued a low warning growl that stopped Mason cold. Something was terribly wrong. By dawn, determined to solve this mystery, Mason lured Ranger inside with beef jerky and locked the door. What he discovered in that doghouse would forever change them both. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Mason Fletcher had never intended to spend his retirement years alone in the Montana wilderness. At 68, his weathered face told the story of a man who'd seen more than his fair share of hardship. The deep lines around his pale blue eyes had been etched by desert sun during 3 tours in Afghanistan, and the slight tremor in his left hand remained a permanent souvenir from an IED that had nearly taken his life 14 years ago. His isolated cabin sat on 10 acres of pine-studded land, far enough from the nearest neighbor that he could go weeks without human contact if he chose, and he often did. Mason preferred it that way since Eleanor passed 5 years ago. Cancer took her quickly, leaving him with a silence that even the Montana winds couldn't fill. But Mason wasn't completely alone. Ranger, his 9-year-old German shepherd, had been by his side since Afghanistan. The military had planned to retire the canine after his handler was killed, but Mason couldn't bear the thought. He'd pulled strings, filed paperwork, and eventually brought Ranger home, a decision that had saved them both in different ways. "Just you and me against the world, eh, boy?" Mason often muttered during their morning walks along the property line. Ranger would respond with an attentive tilt of his head, intelligent amber eyes seemingly understanding every word. Their routine rarely varied. Up at dawn, coffee on the porch watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge, patrol of the property line, breakfast, then whatever projects Mason had planned for the day. Ranger was never more than a few feet away, his presence a constant comfort against the creeping shadows of memory that sometimes threatened to pull Mason back to darker places. The locals in town knew Mason as the quiet veteran who came in for supplies twice a month, always with that impressive German shepherd riding shotgun in his faded blue Ford pickup. Few knew he'd once been Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher, decorated K-9 unit commander. Fewer still knew that Ranger had saved his life 3 times in combat and countless times since, in ways less visible but no less vital. What Mason didn't know, as November turned to December and the first heavy snows blanketed his property, was that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered. The wilderness he'd chosen as refuge was harboring secrets that would soon draw them both into a conflict neither had anticipated. The first sign that something was amiss came on a Tuesday morning in early December. Mason woke to find a dusting of snow on the ground and the temperature hovering just below freezing. Nothing unusual for Montana this time of year. What was unusual was Ranger's absence from his usual spot at the foot of Mason's bed. "Ranger," Mason called, his voice still rough with sleep as he pulled on his flannel robe. The house remained silent. A flicker of concern prompted him to move more quickly toward the kitchen, where he could see through the back window to Ranger's doghouse. There, in the pale morning light, lay Ranger, not inside his insulated shelter, but curled up in the snow beside it. Steam rose from his breath in small clouds as he remained perfectly still, eyes fixed on the doghouse entrance. Mason tapped on the window. Ranger's ears perked up, and he glanced briefly toward the house before returning his attention to the doghouse. This behavior was so out of character that Mason immediately pulled on his boots, not bothering with a coat, and stepped onto the back porch. "What's going on? Boy, too good for the house I built you." Mason kept his tone light, but the concern was growing. He'd spent 2 full weekends constructing that doghouse elevated off the ground to prevent dampness, insulated walls, even a small battery-operated heater for nights like this when the temperature dropped. Ranger had always appreciated it before. As Mason approached, Ranger rose to his feet. His tail gave a perfunctory wag, but his body language was tense. When Mason moved toward the doghouse, something changed in Ranger's demeanor. The dog stepped between Mason and the structure, his posture stiffening. Then came a sound Mason had never heard directed at him, a low, rumbling growl. "Whoa there!" Mason stepped back, genuinely startled. "What's gotten into you?" Ranger stopped growling immediately, but he didn't relax. He remained positioned between Mason and the doghouse, his expression almost apologetic but determined. Mason retreated to the house, watching through the window as Ranger settled back into the snow, resuming his vigil. Throughout that day, Mason checked periodically. Ranger moved occasionally to patrol the perimeter of the yard, but always returned to his position outside the doghouse. He accepted food and water when Mason brought it out, but refused to come inside the main house when called. "Stubborn old mule," Mason muttered, though the words held more worry than criticism. That night, temperatures dropped further. Mason left the back door open, hoping Ranger would come to his senses, but the dog remained outdoors. Through the kitchen window, Mason could see him occasionally rising to shake off the accumulating snow before settling back down. The second day followed much the same pattern. Mason tried coaxing Ranger with treats, but while the dog would approach to take the offered jerky, he immediately returned to his post. By mid-afternoon, Mason noticed the wind picking up, carrying the scent of more snow. The weather report on his ancient radio confirmed his suspicions a significant storm was rolling in, with temperatures expected to plummet well below zero. "This has gone on long enough," Mason declared to the empty kitchen. He put on his heavy coat and work gloves, determined to physically move Ranger into the house if necessary. But as he approached, Ranger's reaction was even more pronounced than before. The growl was deeper, his teeth briefly bared. Not aggressive enough to suggest he would actually bite, but clearly a warning. The standoff lasted several minutes before Mason reluctantly backed away again. Something had spooked his dog, or perhaps Ranger was sensing something Mason couldn't. It wouldn't be the first time. His mind flashed back to a dusty road outside Kandahar. Their convoy had been moving according to schedule when Ranger, riding in the lead vehicle, had suddenly become agitated. His handler couldn't calm him. Mason, then commanding the unit, had ordered a halt and full sweep. They'd found an IED 50 meters ahead, cleverly disguised and powerful enough to have taken out multiple vehicles. Rangers' instincts had saved dozens of lives that day. By the third morning, Mason's worry had deepened to genuine fear. The storm had arrived overnight, bringing 8 inches of fresh snow and temperatures that made the windows creak. Through swirling flakes, he could see Ranger, now partially covered in snow, still maintaining his position. The dog was visibly shivering, but remained steadfast. "This ends now," Mason said, pulling on his heaviest winter gear. He prepared a special treat, leftover steak from his dinner 2 nights ago, warmed and cut into small pieces. As he stepped outside, the cold stole his breath. If it felt this brutal to him, with layers of wool and down, how was Ranger enduring it with only his fur? Mason approached slowly, speaking in a calm, reassuring voice. "Come on, boy. Whatever's bothering you, we'll figure it out. But you can't stay out here." Ranger rose stiffly, his fur crusted with ice. His eyes, those intelligent, loyal eyes, seemed to be pleading for understanding. Mason held out the bowl of steak, and Ranger's nose twitched with interest. Slowly, the dog approached, glancing repeatedly between Mason and the doghouse. "That's it. Good boy," Mason encouraged, backing gradually toward the house. Ranger followed hesitantly, taking a piece of meat, then stopping to look back at the doghouse. With patient coaxing, Mason finally got him through the back door. The moment Ranger crossed the threshold, Mason quickly shut and locked the door. Ranger's reaction was immediate. He whined urgently, scratching at the door and looking back at Mason with what could only be described as panic. The sound broke Mason's heart, but he steeled himself. Whatever was happening, Ranger's safety had to come first. "I'm sorry, boy. I need to check it out," Mason said firmly. "Stay." That last command, the one that had been drilled into Ranger through months of military training, finally penetrated. Ranger stopped scratching but remained tense by the door, whining softly as Mason pulled on his gloves and zipped his coat all the way up. As Mason stepped back into the brutal cold, he noticed fresh tracks in the new snow, too small to be Ranger's, too distinct to be wind-blown debris. Something had been moving around the property while they'd been inside. His senses, honed by years in combat zones, went on high alert as he cautiously approached the doghouse. Mason knelt at the entrance, pulling the small flashlight from his coat pocket. As he leaned down to peer inside, his breath caught in his throat. The beam of light revealed something that made his weathered heart both clench with fear and swell with understanding. What he saw explained everything: Ranger's bizarre behavior, his protective stance, his willingness to endure freezing temperatures. But it also raised questions that sent a chill through Mason, far colder than the Montana winter. Inside the doghouse, huddled against the far wall, was a raccoon. Not just any raccoon, a mother. Her fur matted with what Mason immediately recognized as blood. Wrapped against her belly were 6 tiny kits, pink and nearly hairless, their eyes still sealed shut. The mother's breathing was shallow and labored, her dark eyes meeting Mason's with neither the fear nor aggression typical of her kind. She was too weak for either. "Jesus Christ," Mason whispered, his breath clouding in the frigid air. As the flashlight beam swept across the interior, Mason saw what made his stomach turn. Around the mother raccoon's front leg was a thin wire, cruelly embedded in the flesh. Someone had set a snare trap, and she'd managed to escape with the wire still attached. The wound was badly infected, an ugly red line visible even through her fur. Mason sat back on his heels, suddenly understanding everything. Ranger hadn't been acting strangely, he'd been exhibiting the purest form of compassion. The dog, who'd been trained to detect explosives and take down armed assailants, had recognized a desperate mother in need and had given up his own comfort to stand guard. "You magnificent bastard," Mason murmured, looking back toward the house where Ranger would be watching from the window. The raccoon needed help immediately, that much was clear. But Mason was no veterinarian, and moving newborns in this weather could be a death sentence. As he considered his options, something caught his eye just beyond the doghouse impressions in the snow that didn't match any wildlife tracks he recognized. Boot prints. Someone had been on his property. And recently, Mason followed the tracks with his eyes. They circled around the doghouse before heading toward the tree line that marked the eastern boundary of his property. His neighbors in that direction, the Blackwell brothers, kept largely to themselves. Mason had exchanged nothing more than curt nods with them in the 3 years since he'd moved in. A suspicion began forming in Mason's mind. He'd heard rumors in town about illegal trapping, particularly focused on animals whose pelts fetched high prices. The local game warden had even posted notices about reporting suspected poaching activity. Could the Blackwells be involved? Mason turned his attention back to the immediate problem. The raccoon mother needed medical attention, and those babies wouldn't survive long if she didn't make it. He retreated to the house, where Ranger met him at the door with anxious eyes. "It's all right, boy. I understand now," Mason said, running a gnarled hand over the dog's head. "You've been protecting them. Good dog. Very good dog." Ranger's tail gave a single wag, and the tension in his body eased slightly, as if he sensed Mason was now part of his protective mission rather than an obstacle to it. Mason moved quickly, pulling out his rarely used cell phone and dialing the number for wildlife services that he'd seen posted at the general store. After 3 rings, a woman answered. "Montana Wildlife Response. This is Sarah Thompson. Name's Mason Fletcher. I've got an injured raccoon with newborns on my property. Looks like she got caught in a snare trap, wires still embedded in her leg, wounds infected." There was a pause on the other end. "Can you tell me your location, Mr. Fletcher?" Mason gave her the details, explaining his isolated position and the current weather conditions. "I'll be honest with you," Sarah responded, her voice professional but concerned. "With this storm, it's going to be difficult for anyone to reach you today. The county's pulled the plows until the wind dies down. The animal needs help now," Mason insisted, watching as Ranger paced anxiously by the door. "I understand. Are you comfortable providing some emergency care until we can get there? I can talk you through it." Mason looked down at his hands that had field-dressed wounds in combat, repaired engines, built structures, and nodded to himself. "Tell me what to do." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah guided him through gathering supplies, clean towels, warm water, antiseptic, antibiotics left over from Ranger's last ear infection, tweezers, scissors, gloves. She explained how to approach the injured animal, how to possibly remove the wire, how to clean the wound. "The babies are the tricky part," she cautioned. They need to stay warm and with their mother if at all possible. Raccoons are surprisingly good mothers, and she'll likely continue caring for them even while injured, as long as she has the strength. After hanging up, Mason prepared everything. Placing supplies in a small tub, he looked at Ranger. "I'm going to need your help, boy." "No growling at Mama Raccoon." "Understood." Ranger tilted his head, those intelligent eyes seeming to process the instruction. Together they returned to the doghouse. Mason moved slowly, speaking in a soft, reassuring voice as he approached the entrance again. The raccoon mother hadn't moved, her eyes following him warily but without the strength to defend herself. "I'm going to help you," Mason told her, knowing she couldn't understand the words but hoping his tone might convey his intentions. To his surprise, Ranger positioned himself at the entrance of the doghouse, not blocking Mason but clearly standing guard. The dog's eyes scanned the surrounding area vigilantly, as if he was ensuring no threats would interrupt the delicate operation. With careful movements, Mason reached into the doghouse. The mother raccoon flinched but didn't attempt to bite as he gently examined the wire around her leg. It was worse than he'd initially thought. The thin metal had cut almost to the bone in places. "Easy now," Mason murmured, as much to steady himself as to calm the animal. Using the tweezers and scissors, he delicately worked to cut the wire without causing additional damage. The raccoon trembled but remained still, almost as if she understood this painful process was necessary. When the wire finally came free, Mason cleaned the wound as best he could with antiseptic wipes, then carefully wrapped it with gauze. Throughout the procedure, he was acutely aware of the tiny kits, making sure they remained nestled against their mother's warmth. When he finally sat back, exhausted from maintaining the awkward position, the raccoon was breathing a bit easier, though she was clearly still in distress. "That's all I can do for now, girl," he said softly. "The rest is up to you." As Mason gathered his supplies, he noticed Ranger had moved. The dog was standing alert, facing the tree line, his ears forward and body tense, following his gaze. Mason spotted movement, a figure in dark clothing at the edge of the woods, watching. Before Mason could react, the figure retreated into the trees. "Damn it," Mason muttered, squinting against the swirling snow. That was definitely a person. And judging by the direction, likely one of the Blackwell brothers. Back inside the house, Mason called Sarah Thompson again to update her on the raccoon's condition and to ask a question that had been forming in his mind. "These snare traps, are they legal around here?" There was a pause before she answered. "Not the way they're being used. We've had issues with illegal trapping in your area for the past few months. Animals taken out of season, protected species being targeted, traps set without proper tagging or on private property without permission." "Would you say the Blackwell property might be a place of interest for this kind of activity?" Another pause, longer this time. "I can't comment specifically on ongoing investigations, Mr. Fletcher, but I would advise caution in how you proceed. Some people take their right to trap very seriously, even when they're breaking the law." After hanging up, Mason stood at the window, watching as Ranger once again took up his position outside the doghouse, lying in the snow as guardian to the injured mother and her babies. The loyalty and compassion of the dog struck Mason deeply. contrasting sharply with the cruelty evidenced by that thin wire cutting into living flesh. Something shifted in Mason's chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since retiring from the military. Someone was causing harm on or near his property, and now that harm had literally shown up at his doorstep. As he watched his faithful companion shivering yet steadfast in the snow, Mason made a decision. This wasn't just about one injured raccoon anymore. This was about right and wrong. And Mason Fletcher had never been one to look the other way when something wasn't right. Mason spent the next hour constructing a temporary shelter for the raccoon family. He found an old wooden crate in his storage shed, lined it with soft blankets, and carefully installed the small battery-powered heater from Ranger's doghouse. The structure wasn't perfect, but it would provide better protection than the doghouse while keeping the raccoons close enough that Ranger could maintain his self-appointed guardianship. "You're going to have to share your heating pad, boy," Mason told Ranger as he worked. The dog watched intently, seeming to understand the purpose behind Mason's efforts. Moving the raccoon family proved to be the most delicate part of the operation. Mason lined a shallow cardboard box with a heating pack and towels, then gently lifted the mother and her kits as a unit, trying to disturb them as little as possible. The mother raccoon was too weak to resist, though her eyes followed his every movement. Throughout the transfer, Ranger stayed close, his posture alert but non-threatening. Once the raccoons were settled in their new shelter, Mason placed it near the back porch where it would be somewhat protected from the wind while remaining visible from the kitchen window. He could monitor them while still allowing Ranger to keep watch. "This is temporary," he told both Ranger and the raccoon mother. "As soon as the road's clear, we'll get you proper help." With the immediate crisis addressed, Mason turned his attention to the mysterious boot prints and the figure he'd spotted at the tree line. He retrieved his binoculars from the top shelf of his closet, wiping away a thin layer of dust. They were military grade, capable of clear vision even in low-light conditions. Standing at his east-facing window, he studied the Blackwell property in the distance. The Blackwell place was about half a mile away, partially obscured by pine trees. From what Mason could see, there appeared to be unusual activity for such a stormy day. A truck was parked outside, and figures moved between the house and a large outbuilding. Mason adjusted the focus, trying to get a better look at what they were carrying. "What are you fellows up to?" he murmured to himself. As darkness began to fall, Mason prepared dinner, a simple meal of beans and cornbread. As he ate, his mind drifted back to Eleanor. She would have known exactly what to do about the raccoons. His late wife had been a biology teacher with a particular fondness for local wildlife. Their backyard in Virginia, where they'd lived before moving to Montana, had been designated as a wildlife habitat under her careful stewardship. "You'd be proud of Ranger," he said aloud to the empty kitchen, a habit he'd developed in the years since her passing. "Taking care of those little ones like they were his own." After dinner, Mason checked on the raccoon family again. The mother seemed slightly more alert, though still obviously ill. He managed to coax her to drink some water mixed with a tiny amount of sugar for energy, using a turkey baster to deliver it in small drops. 2 of the kits were nursing weakly, a good sign. When he finally went to bed that night, Mason left the back porch light on and the curtains open so he could see the makeshift shelter. Ranger had refused to come inside, instead positioning himself beside the crate, his body creating a windbreak for the vulnerable family. "Stubborn old soldier," Mason muttered with grudging admiration before falling into an uneasy sleep. Morning brought clearer skies and slightly warmer temperatures, though the snow remained deep across the property. Mason's first action was to check on the raccoons. To his relief, the mother was conscious and had clearly been tending to her kits during the night. The wound on her leg still looked angry and inflamed, but at least she was alive. Mason refreshed the water and heating packs, then rewarded Ranger with a hearty breakfast of kibble mixed with scrambled eggs, a special treat for his extraordinary service. While the dog ate, Mason called Sarah Thompson again. "Road should be clear enough by this afternoon," she informed him. "I can be there around 3 with medical supplies. How's our patient doing?" Mason described the raccoon's condition, including the positive signs he'd observed. "That's encouraging," Sarah replied. "By the way, I'm curious, did you happen to notice anything unusual in the area before finding the injured raccoon? Any unfamiliar vehicles or people?" The question confirmed Mason's suspicions that the Wildlife Department was indeed investigating something in the vicinity. He told her about the boot prints and the figure he'd spotted. "I see," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Fletcher, when I visit today, I might have some additional questions for you, if that's all right." After hanging up, Mason decided to do some investigating of his own. In his garage, tucked into a dusty toolbox, were 2 trail cameras he'd purchased years ago to track deer movements on the property. He'd never gotten around to setting them up, but they might prove useful now. It took him nearly an hour to figure out how the cameras worked, reading through the instruction manual with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Once he understood the basics, he pulled on his heavy coat and boots. "Stay with our guests," he instructed Ranger, who was reluctant to leave his post anyway. Mason trudged through the snow to the eastern edge of his property, where it bordered the Blackwell land, finding suitable trees. He mounted the cameras facing in different directions, angling them to capture movement along what appeared to be a crude path through the woods. If anyone was crossing his property regularly, the cameras would document it, as would. As he worked, Mason couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice he paused, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing definitive. Still, years in combat zones had taught him to trust his instincts. Someone was out there. On his way back to the cabin, Mason took a detour, following the faint impression of the boot prints he'd noticed earlier. They led toward a small clearing about 200 yards into the woods. There, partially hidden by undergrowth and now covered with a layer of snow, Mason found what he was looking for: disturbed ground and a thin metal stake driven into the earth. A trap had been set here, and recently— "Son of a bitch," he muttered, kneeling to examine the area more closely. The trap itself was gone, likely the one that had caught the raccoon mother, but the setup was unmistakable. This was no legal trapping operation with proper tags and registration. This was poaching, plain and simple. Mason marked the location in his mind and continued his search, finding 2 more trap sites before heading back to the cabin. His blood was simmering with a slow, steady anger. Not only were these traps illegal, but they were also on his property without permission. Someone had been trespassing, setting cruel devices that caused suffering to animals that hadn't done anything wrong. When he reached the cabin, Ranger greeted him with an urgent bark. The dog led him straight to the raccoon shelter, where Mason discovered the mother in obvious distress. Her breathing had become more labored, and she was struggling to tend to her kits. "Hang in there, girl," Mason murmured, refreshing the water and checking her wound. The infection seemed to be worsening despite his efforts. Help's coming this afternoon. Throughout the day, Mason kept a close eye on both the raccoon family and the tree line. Around noon, he noticed a vehicle moving slowly along the distant road that separated his property from the Blackwells. Through his binoculars, he identified it as a dark green pickup truck with a cap over the bed, a vehicle he'd seen parked at the Blackwell place before. The truck stopped briefly at the point where the crude trail entered the woods. A man stepped out, the younger Blackwell brother, Tim, if Mason recalled correctly. He appeared to be scanning the area, perhaps looking for something. After a few minutes, he returned to his truck and continued down the road. "What are you looking for?" Mason wondered aloud, making a mental note to check his trail cameras the next day. At precisely 3 o'clock, another vehicle appeared on the main road, a white SUV with the Montana Wildlife Department logo on the door. Mason felt a surge of relief as it turned onto his long driveway. Sarah Thompson was younger than Mason had expected, probably in her mid-30s, but her handshake was firm and her eyes sharp as she introduced herself. She wore the department's standard uniform under an open winter coat, with a medical kit slung over her shoulder. "Thank you for calling this in, Mr. Fletcher," she said as she followed him to the raccoon shelter. Most people wouldn't go to this much trouble. Ranger had risen to greet the newcomer, but quickly returned to his post beside the crate. He watched with intelligent eyes as Sarah knelt to examine the raccoon mother and her kits. "You've done an impressive job with first aid," she commented, carefully checking the bandaged leg. "Military training." "Army," Mason confirmed. "Picked up some field medicine over the years." Sarah worked methodically, cleaning the wound more thoroughly than Mason had been able to, administering antibiotics via injection and checking each of the kits. Her movements were gentle but confident. "The good news is, she's stronger than she looks," Sarah said finally, repacking her kit. "The infection is concerning, but the antibiotics should help. The kits are in reasonable condition. Considering you giving her sugar water was smart, kept her energy up enough to care for them." "Will they make it?" Mason asked, aware of how much he'd come to care about the outcome in just 24 hours. "I think they've got a good chance, especially with your help." Sarah glanced at Ranger with an appreciative smile. "And with such a dedicated guardian." As they walked back toward the cabin, Mason decided to broach the subject that had been on his mind since morning. "Found some trap sites on my property today," he said casually, watching for her reaction. "Illegal ones, from the look of them. No tags, no registration numbers." Sarah's stride faltered slightly, the only indication that his words had struck a nerve. "Did you now?" she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'd be interested in seeing those." Inside, over coffee, Sarah's professional demeanor remained intact, but Mason could sense her keen interest as he described what he'd found. He spread out a hand-drawn map of his property on the kitchen table, marking the locations of the trap sites. "This isn't the first report we've had," she admitted after studying the map. "There's been an increase in illegal trapping and wildlife trafficking in this county over the past year. We've found evidence of organized poaching, not just opportunistic hunting, but systematic operations targeting specific animals for their pelts and other parts." "The Blackwells involved?" Mason asked directly. Sarah hesitated. "I can't discuss specifics of an ongoing investigation, but I will say that we're looking at several local properties, and your information could be very helpful." She produced a business card and handed it to him. "If you notice anything else unusual, call me directly. My cell number is on the back." As Sarah prepared to leave, she glanced once more at the raccoon family and Ranger maintaining his vigilant watch. "Your dog is remarkable," she observed. "Most dogs would have either ignored the raccoons or seen them as prey." "Ranger's not most dogs," Mason replied, a note of pride in his voice. "He was the best detection dog in our unit in Afghanistan. Saved more lives than I can count. Seems he's still in the protection business." After Sarah departed, Mason stood at the window, watching her SUV navigate the snowy driveway. The conversation had confirmed his suspicions. Something illegal was happening in the area, and the Wildlife Department was actively investigating. The question was, how deeply were the Blackwells involved, and what risks might Mason be taking by poking around? As darkness fell again, Mason checked on the raccoon family one last time before heading to bed. The mother seemed marginally better after Sarah's treatment, though still far from healthy. Ranger refused again to come inside, standing guard despite the cold. "At least take this, you hard-headed hero," Mason said, bringing out an old wool blanket and draping it over the dog's back. Ranger accepted this compromise, settling down with the blanket while maintaining his protective position. That night, Mason dreamed of Eleanor. They were walking together along a forest path, sunlight filtering through the trees. She was pointing out different plants and animal tracks, her face animated with the joy she always found in nature. "Everything is connected, Mason," she was saying in the dream. "You can't harm one part without affecting the whole." He woke before dawn, the echo of her voice still in his mind. Outside, a fresh dusting of snow had fallen. Mason made coffee and carried a mug to the window, checking on Ranger and the raccoons in the pale pre-dawn light. All seemed quiet. Then he noticed something that made him set down his coffee with a sharp movement. On his back porch, clearly visible in the fresh snow, were human footprints. Someone had approached the raccoon shelter during the night, circled it once, then departed not toward the road, but back toward the eastern property line. Mason grabbed his coat and flashlight, stepping out into the cold morning air. Ranger was alert but hadn't barked, suggesting whoever had visited was someone the dog didn't perceive as an immediate threat. Following the tracks to the porch steps, Mason found a small piece of paper wedged between the boards. He unfolded it with stiff fingers. The message was brief and unsigned. "Mind your own business, old man." Mason stood perfectly still, the paper clutched in his hand, as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about illegal trapping anymore. Someone felt threatened enough by his actions to issue a warning, which meant he was getting close to something significant. Instead of intimidating him, the note had the opposite effect. A familiar feeling stirred in Mason's chest, one he hadn't experienced since his military days, the calm, focused resolve that came with knowing exactly what needed to be done. Someone was breaking the law on his property, harming innocent creatures, and now attempting to frighten him. Mason Fletcher had faced Taliban fighters and IEDs. He wasn't about to be scared off by a note. As the sun rose fully over the Montana landscape, Mason went inside and retrieved something he hadn't touched in years, a locked metal case stored at the back of his closet. Inside was his personal sidearm, a Beretta M9 he'd been allowed to keep after retirement. He checked it methodically, loaded it, and placed it in the drawer of his bedside table. Not for use, he told himself. Just precaution. But as he glanced once more at the note in his hand, Mason knew that the line had been drawn. Whatever happened next, he was prepared to protect what was his property, his peace, and the vulnerable creatures who had, unexpectedly, come under his care. 3 days passed without incident. The raccoon mother gradually improved under Mason's care, becoming more active and attentive to her kits. The threatening note remained in Mason's pocket, a constant reminder of the invisible boundary that had been crossed. Each morning and evening, he checked his trail cameras, but the heavy snow had apparently deterred whoever was setting traps on his land. On the 4th morning, Mason woke to Ranger's distinctive alert bark, 3 sharp sounds that the dog had been trained to use when identifying a potential threat. Mason pulled on his boots and coat over his pajamas and hurried to the back door. Through the window, he could see Ranger standing at attention, facing the eastern tree line, his posture rigid. In the pale dawn light, 2 figures were moving along the edge of Mason's property. Even from a distance, Mason recognized the Blackwell brothers by their distinctive silhouettes. Tim, the younger one, tall and lanky. Robert, the elder, stockier, with a characteristic lumbering gait. They appeared to be checking something in the underbrush, moving methodically from spot to spot. "Checking their traps," Mason muttered, feeling his jaw tighten. Without hesitation, he grabbed his keys and the Beretta, tucking the latter into his coat pocket. This wasn't how he'd planned to address the situation, but he wasn't about to let them continue trespassing and poaching on his land. "Ranger, stay," he commanded firmly, pointing to the raccoon shelter. The dog looked torn, clearly wanting to accompany Mason but unwilling to abandon his charges. After a moment of indecision, Ranger settled reluctantly by the crate, his eyes following Mason's movement across the yard. Mason approached quietly, using the trees for cover, his footsteps muffled by the snow. Years of military training made his movement nearly silent despite his age. As he drew closer, he could hear fragments of conversation. "Should have been right here," Tim was saying, kicking at the snow in frustration. "That's 3 missing now." "Someone's messing with us," Robert replied, his voice a low growl. "Probably that new wildlife officer. The Thompson woman. Been poking around asking questions in town." "What about the old man?" Tim gestured vaguely in the direction of Mason's cabin. "Fletcher. Saw his lights on at all hours last few nights. Mind your own damn business. Blackwell," Mason called out, stepping from behind a large pine tree. Both brothers whirled around, startled by his sudden appearance. Robert recovered first, his weathered face settling into a scowl. "We're just walking our property line, Fletcher. No law against that." "Except you're about 50 yards onto my side of the line," Mason replied evenly, pointing to a faded marker post partially visible through the snow. "And I suspect you're not just out for a morning constitutional." Tim shifted uncomfortably, but Robert stood his ground. "What's it to you what we're doing on our own land?" "Nothing at all," Mason said. "But when you start setting illegal traps on my property, that becomes my business." He pulled the threatening note from his pocket, holding it up. "And when you start leaving threatening messages, well, That just makes me curious what you're so afraid I'll find out. Robert's face darkened. Don't know nothing about any note, but I'd be careful throwing around accusations about illegal trapping. Old man, might find yourself in trouble. I already found one of your victims, Mason continued, ignoring the threat. Female raccoon, wire snare embedded in her leg. Left 6 newborns orphaned if she hadn't managed to drag herself to my place. A flicker of something recognition, perhaps even guilt, crossed Tim's face, but Robert remained impassive. Lots of folks trap around here, Robert said dismissively. Legal activity when done right. When done right, Mason agreed. With proper permits, registered traps, respect for seasons and protected species. Somehow I don't think that's what you're doing, sneaking around at dawn checking trap sites on someone else's land. The confrontation might have escalated further, but the distant sound of a vehicle approaching on the main road drew their attention. A familiar white SUV was turning onto Mason's driveway. Wildlife Department, Mason observed. Perfect timing. Why don't we all have a chat with Officer Thompson about those missing traps of yours? Robert grabbed his brother's arm. We're done here, he said flatly. Then fixed Mason with a hard stare. This isn't over, Fletcher. The brothers retreated quickly toward their own property, disappearing into the trees before Sarah's vehicle reached the cabin. Mason watched them go, making mental notes of their direction and behavior. There was something more going on than just illegal trapping. The brothers' reaction had been too strong, too defensive. Sarah Thompson looked surprised to find Mason outside in his pajamas and coat when she pulled up. "Early morning nature walk, Mr. Fletcher?" she asked as she stepped out of her vehicle, carrying a small animal carrier and medical supplies. "Something like that," Mason replied, deciding not to mention the confrontation immediately. "Come to check on our patients." As they walked to the raccoon shelter, Mason casually mentioned finding additional trap sites and his suspicions about the Blackwells. Sarah listened attentively, asking occasional questions about locations and timing. "I'd like to see these sites," she said, after examining the raccoon mother, who was responding well to treatment. "And I'd be very interested in looking at whatever your trail cameras might have captured." Mason led Sarah to his workshop, where he'd set up a laptop to review the camera footage. Most of the images showed nothing unusual: a few deer, an owl, normal woodland activity. But on the second memory card, time-stamped 2 nights ago around 2 a.m., there was a clear image of Tim Blackwell checking what appeared to be a trap location. In the next image, taken a minute later, he was looking directly at the camera, his expression a mixture of surprise and anger. "That would explain the warning note I received the next morning," Mason commented, showing Sarah the crumpled paper. Sarah's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. "Mr. Fletcher, this has gone beyond wildlife violations. Threatening a private citizen is a serious matter. I think it's time I brought the sheriff into this." Before Mason could respond, Ranger's alert bark sounded from outside. They moved quickly to the window in time to see a dark green pickup truck slow to a stop on the main road. Robert Blackwell was at the wheel, staring directly at the cabin. "Seems like you've stirred up a hornet's nest," Sarah observed quietly. "Not the first time," Mason replied. "Let me show you those trap sites before our friend out there decides to come back with reinforcements." They spent the next hour documenting the locations Mason had discovered, with Sarah taking photographs and GPS coordinates. The raccoon mother's injury provided clear evidence of illegal trapping methods, and the trail camera footage confirmed trespassing. By the time they returned to the cabin, Sarah had enough information to file a comprehensive report. "There's a town meeting tonight at the community center," she mentioned as she prepared to leave. "Wildlife management is on the agenda. Given what we've found, it might get contentious. The Blackwells have friends in the area, other landowners who may be involved in similar activities." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "I'll be there," after Sarah departed. Mason spent the day reinforcing the raccoon shelter and checking his property boundaries. Ranger remained vigilant, occasionally growling toward the eastern tree line, though no one visibly approached. By late afternoon, Mason had decided on a course of action. He would attend the town meeting, present what he knew, and force the issue into the open. The Mill Creek Community Center was an old converted schoolhouse that served as the hub for local gatherings. By the time Mason arrived that evening, the parking lot was nearly full, an unusual turnout for a routine town meeting. He recognized many of the vehicles, including the Blackwells' green pickup parked prominently near the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with tension. About 40 people had gathered, forming clear factions around the room. Sarah Thompson stood near the front, conversing quietly with Sheriff Dale Parker, a heavy-set man with a perpetually tired expression. The Blackwell brothers sat surrounded by a group of men Mason recognized as local landowners and hunters. Mason chose a seat near the back, nodding politely to those he knew. A few nodded back, others looked away deliberately. The division in the room was palpable. Mayor Jim Harkins called the meeting to order, moving quickly through routine business before arriving at the main agenda item: wildlife management concerns and regulatory enforcement. Sarah Thompson presented first, her manner professional and matter-of-fact, as she outlined the increasing problem of illegal trapping and poaching in the county. She never mentioned the Blackwells by name, but her references to specific areas and methods left little doubt about the targets of the investigation. "This isn't just about following regulations," she concluded. "It's about sustainable wildlife management and humane treatment of animals. The wire snares we're finding cause unnecessary suffering and often target protected species." Robert Blackwell was the first to respond, rising from his seat with deliberate slowness. "Some of us have been trapping these lands for generations," he began, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. "My grandfather taught my father, who taught me and my brother. Now we've got government officials telling us we can't manage our own land the way we see fit." Murmurs of agreement rose from his supporters. "No one's saying you can't trap legally," Sarah countered. "But we're finding unregistered traps, protected species being taken, traps set on private property without permission." "Hearsay and assumptions," Robert interrupted. "Where's your proof?" The sheriff cleared his throat. "Actually, we've got documented evidence of illegal trapping methods and trespassing, trail camera footage, physical traps recovered without proper registration, injured wildlife consistent with prohibited snare types." Robert's face darkened. "And I suppose the evidence comes from our new neighbor, Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher, the recluse who barely speaks to anyone in town but suddenly appoints himself wildlife protector." All eyes turned to Mason, who remained seated, meeting Robert's gaze steadily. "Mr. Fletcher has provided evidence, yes," Sarah confirmed, "as have other landowners concerned about trespassing and illegal trapping on their properties." "Fletcher doesn't understand our ways," another man called out Ben Reynolds, whose property adjoined the Blackwells. "He's an outsider bringing city ideas to our community." Mason finally stood, his movement deliberate and unhurried. The room quieted as he walked to the front, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and measured steps. "I may be relatively new to this community," he began, his voice steady and clear, "but I understand the difference between tradition and law-breaking. I understand property rights, both mine and yours, and I certainly understand the difference between humane hunting for sustenance and cruel trapping for profit." He described finding the injured raccoon, careful to emphasize the unnecessary suffering caused by the wire snare. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This isn't about government overreach or outsiders versus locals," Mason continued. "It's about respecting the law, respecting property boundaries, and having basic decency toward living creatures." "Easy to talk about decency when you've spent your life in the military, following orders," Robert shot back. "Some of us have to make a living off this land." Mason's expression hardened slightly. "I've seen people make all sorts of justifications for cruelty, Mr. Blackwell. Usually because there's money involved. How much does a raccoon pelt fetch these days in the illegal wildlife trade?" The question hung in the air. Landing like a grenade in the center of the room, Robert's face flushed deep red, and Tim looked down at the floor. Several of their supporters exchanged uneasy glances. "That's a serious accusation," Sheriff Parker said, stepping forward. "Do you have evidence of wildlife trafficking, Mr. Fletcher?" Before Mason could respond, the community center door burst open. A young deputy hurried in, making his way directly to the sheriff. They conferred in hushed tones for a moment before Sheriff Parker turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to adjourn this meeting. My deputies have just executed a search warrant at the old Prescott warehouse based on information received earlier today. They've discovered what appears to be a significant illegal wildlife processing operation." The room erupted in exclamations and questions. Through the commotion, Mason locked eyes with Robert Blackwell, whose expression had shifted from anger to something more calculating. As the sheriff continued providing details, Robert leaned over to whisper something to his brother. Then, with deliberate casualness, the two brothers began moving toward the side exit. Mason watched them go, a sense of unease settling in his gut. Something wasn't right. The Blackwells weren't acting like men caught in wrongdoing. They were acting like men executing a contingency plan. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Mason slipped out the main entrance and hurried to his truck. A single thought dominated his mind. Ranger and the raccoons were alone at the cabin, and he had just publicly confronted the men who had been trespassing on his property. He needed to get home, fast. Mason's ancient Ford pickup roared to life, the engine protesting briefly before settling into a determined rumble. He reversed out of the community center parking lot with more speed than caution, earning a startled look from an elderly couple making their way to their car. The Blackwells' green truck was already gone, though Mason hadn't seen which direction they'd headed. The drive home should have taken 15 minutes. Mason made it in 11, taking the winding country roads with the focused precision of someone whose mind had calculated every curve and potential hazard. Darkness had fully descended, and heavy clouds obscured the moon, making the rural route even more treacherous. Light snowfall had begun again, adding another layer of risk to his urgent journey. As he approached the final turn toward his driveway, Mason's headlights caught something that made his blood run cold, fresh tire tracks in the new snow. Turning onto his property, someone had arrived before him. Mason killed his headlights and coasted the final 100 yards, pulling off to the side of the road rather than continuing up his driveway. The cabin was dark, no lights visible from this distance, but that meant nothing. He'd left a single lamp on in the living room, which should have been visible from here, moving with practiced stealth despite his age. Mason retrieved the Beretta from his glove compartment and tucked it into his coat pocket. The familiar weight was both reassuring and sobering. 40 years in uniform had taught him that drawing a weapon was always the last resort, but having it available could make the difference between options and none. The snow crunched softly under his boots as he made his way through the trees paralleling his driveway. About halfway to the cabin, he spotted a vehicle parked haphazardly near his workshop, not the Blackwell's green truck, but a battered blue Jeep he recognized as belonging to Wade Simmons, one of the men who had been sitting with the Blackwells at the meeting. Approaching cautiously, Mason could make out a single figure moving around the back of his cabin, the beam of a flashlight sweeping the area where he'd placed the raccoon shelter. The realization of what was happening struck him with physical force. They weren't here for him, they were here for evidence. The raccoon mother and her kits would be living proof of the illegal trapping methods. But where was Ranger? The dog should have been raising an alarm, yet the property remained eerily silent. Mason circled wider, using the tree line for cover, working his way toward the back of the property. As he drew closer, he could make out Wade's bulky figure bending over the raccoon shelter. Flashlight gripped between his teeth as both hands worked at something. A large canvas bag lay open on the ground beside him. Still no sign of Ranger, which was increasingly worrying. The German Shepherd was meticulously trained and fiercely protective. He wouldn't have abandoned his post willingly. "Don't do it, Wade," Mason called out, his voice cutting through the night air like a blade. Wade Simmons straightened abruptly, the flashlight dropping from his mouth into the snow. "Fletcher," he said, squinting into the darkness, "this ain't what it looks like. Looks like you're trespassing on my property, tampering with evidence of wildlife crimes, and planning to remove injured animals," Mason replied, stepping forward into the dim light spilling from the cabin windows. "Where's my dog? Wade?" Wade shifted uncomfortably, his right hand drifting toward his jacket pocket. "Your dog's fine. Gave him something to keep him quiet for a while. He'll sleep it off." A cold fury swept through Mason. "You drugged my dog." He took another step forward, close enough now to see the tranquilizer gun partially concealed under Wade's open jacket. "Just business, Fletcher," Wade said, his voice hardening. "Nothing personal. These animals are worth a lot to the right buyers. You should have minded your own business like the note said." "This is my business," Mason countered. "My property, my dog, my responsibility. Where is Ranger?" Wade gestured vaguely toward the workshop. "Sleeping it off in there. He'll be fine in a few hours. Now, I'm going to take these animals and leave, and we can forget this happened." "That's not how this is going to work," Mason said evenly. "You're going to step away from that shelter. Keep your hands where I can see them, and wait here while I call Sheriff Parker." A humorless laugh escaped Wade's lips. "Sheriff's busy at the warehouse." That was the point. Create a distraction. Clean up the loose ends. He reached for the canvas bag. "I don't want trouble, Fletcher, but I'm taking these animals. Mason's hand moved to his coat pocket. "Last warning. Wade, step back." The moment hung suspended between them, possibility branching in multiple directions. Then Wade made his choice. In one fluid motion, he drew the tranquilizer gun from his jacket and fired. Mason's military training took over. He pivoted sideways, the dart whistling past his ear to embed itself in a tree trunk behind him. Before Wade could reload, Mason closed the distance between them with surprising speed for a man his age, tackling Wade to the ground. The impact drove the breath from both men. Wade, younger and heavier, recovered first. He landed a solid punch to Mason's ribs, rolling them both in the snow. They grappled in the darkness, steam rising from their exertion in the cold night air. "You're in over your head, old man," Wade grunted, trying to pin Mason's arms. Mason didn't waste breath responding. Instead, he drove his knee upward, connecting with Wade's midsection. As the younger man doubled over, Mason broke free of his grip and scrambled back a few feet, drawing the Beretta from his pocket. "Enough," he said, breathing heavily as he aimed the weapon at Wade. "It's over." Wade froze, eyes locked on the gun. "You won't shoot me over some raccoons, Fletcher?" "I won't have to if you cooperate," Mason replied. "Where are the Blackwells? Are they coming here too?" A flicker of something uncertainty perhaps crossed Wade's face. "They were heading to the warehouse. Robert wanted to clean out some records before the sheriff's men found them." Mason calculated quickly. If that was true, he had time to secure Wade and check on Ranger before the brothers arrived if they were coming at all. If Wade was lying to stall for time, the situation could become much more complicated very quickly. "Get up slowly and walk to my truck," Mason instructed, keeping the Beretta trained on Wade. "We're going to find my dog. Then we're calling this in." Wade rose reluctantly, brushing snow from his clothes. "You're making a mistake. Fletcher, the Blackwells have connections you don't understand. This goes beyond some illegal trapping." "Move," Mason said simply, gesturing with the gun. They had taken only a few steps when a low growl emerged from the shadows near the workshop. Both men froze. Mason felt a surge of relief as a familiar silhouette appeared, moving unsteadily but with clear purpose. Ranger had regained consciousness. The German shepherd advanced slowly, his normally fluid gait compromised by whatever drug Wade had administered. His hackles were raised, teeth bared in the moonlight as he focused on Wade. "Call off your dog, Fletcher," Wade said, tension evident in his voice. "Ranger, halt," Mason commanded. The dog stopped advancing but maintained his aggressive stance, a continuous growl rumbling from his chest. "He'll stay there as long as you cooperate. Move toward the truck." They had nearly reached Mason's pickup when headlights swept across the property as another vehicle turned into the driveway. The Blackwells had arrived. "Looks like your backup is here," Mason said grimly, calculating his increasingly limited options. Wade smiled for the first time. "Told you this was bigger than you thought." But as the vehicle came to a stop, it wasn't the Blackwells' green truck that emerged from the darkness. It was Sarah Thompson's white SUV, with Sheriff Parker's patrol car right behind it. Wade's smile vanished. "That's impossible. They're supposed to be at the warehouse." "Seems like your distraction didn't work as planned," Mason observed as Sarah and the sheriff approached, weapons drawn. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Wade was handcuffed and placed in the back of the sheriff's patrol car. Sarah immediately checked on the raccoon family, confirming they were unharmed. Mason focused on Ranger, kneeling beside his loyal companion to check his condition. "Good boy," he murmured, running his hands along the dog's body, checking for injuries. "You fought it off, didn't you, good soldier?" Ranger's eyes were still slightly unfocused, but he leaned against Mason's side, his tail offering a weak wag of recognition. The veterinarian Sarah had brought with her confirmed that Ranger had been hit with a tranquilizer dart but would recover fully with rest. "We got a tip about the warehouse being a distraction," Sheriff Parker explained once the situation was under control. Anonymous call from someone who'd been at the meeting said the real evidence was being moved while we were occupied with the raid. "The Blackwells?" Mason asked. "Deputies are looking for them now." The sheriff confirmed. "Their truck was spotted heading north toward the state line. Wade here will probably be more cooperative once he realizes they left him to take the fall." As relief began to replace adrenaline, Mason suddenly felt every one of his 68 years. His ribs ached where Wade had landed a punch, and the cold had settled deep into his bones during the confrontation. He lowered himself carefully onto the porch steps, Ranger leaning heavily against his leg. "You should get checked out," Sarah suggested, noticing his discomfort. "Both of you." Mason shook his head. "I've had worse. Ranger needs to rest off the drugs, and I need to keep an eye on our raccoon family. We'll be fine." The veterinarian disagreed, insisting on examining both man and dog. Ranger was given a mild counteragent to help metabolize the tranquilizer faster, while Mason grudgingly allowed his ribs to be wrapped after it was determined nothing was broken. By the time the authorities departed, with promises to post a deputy nearby until the Blackwells were apprehended, exhaustion had overtaken Mason completely. He helped Ranger into the cabin, setting up a comfortable bed near the wood stove, before settling in himself. Mason checked one last time on the raccoon family. The mother looked up at him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold an understanding beyond words. "We're safe now," he told her softly, though the knowledge that the Blackwells remained at large tempered his relief. "Rest easy." As Mason finally lowered himself onto his bed, Ranger managed to climb up beside him, despite his unsteady legs, something the dog had never done before. Mason didn't have the heart to send him back to his own bed. Instead, he rested one hand on Ranger's thick fur, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. They had survived the first battle, but Mason's instincts told him the war wasn't over. The Blackwells wouldn't abandon their operation so easily, especially if Wade was right about connections and the scope of their activities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, rest was the priority. His last thought before drifting into uneasy sleep was of Eleanor. She would have been proud of them today, proud of Ranger's loyalty and Mason's stand against cruelty. In the darkness of the cabin, it almost felt as if she were there, watching over them both. Mason woke at dawn to the sound of Ranger whimpering. The dog was attempting to stand, his leg still unsteady from the lingering effects of the tranquilizer. Mason eased himself up, wincing at the sharp pain in his ribs, and helped Ranger navigate to the back door. "Easy does it, boy," he murmured, supporting the German shepherd's weight as they made their way outside. The morning air was crisp and clear, the storm having passed during the night. Fresh snow blanketed the property, erasing all traces of the previous night's confrontation. Only the yellow police tape around Wade's abandoned Jeep served as evidence that anything unusual had occurred, after Ranger had relieved himself. Mason checked on the raccoon family. The mother seemed more alert this morning, watching Mason with wary intelligence as he refreshed her water and provided a small amount of soft food that Sarah had left for her. The kits were noticeably larger than when Mason had first found them, their tiny bodies now covered with a light fuzz of fur. "You're a survivor," Mason told the mother raccoon quietly. "Guess we all are." Back inside, Mason had just started brewing coffee when his phone rang. It was Sheriff Parker, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Fletcher, thought you should know we located the Blackwell's truck abandoned near the Canadian border last night. No sign of the brothers themselves." Mason absorbed this information silently before asking, "Wade talking?" "Like a songbird," the sheriff confirmed. "What he's revealed is concerning. This operation goes beyond local poaching. They've been supplying animal parts to international buyers, specialized markets in Asia primarily, highly organized, very lucrative. And the connections Wade mentioned, a hesitation on the line, that's where it gets complicated. Wade's implicated several prominent community members as investors or facilitators. We're proceeding carefully given the accusations." After hanging up, Mason sat at his kitchen table, absent-mindedly stroking Ranger's head as the dog leaned against his leg. The tranquilizer was wearing off, but Ranger was still not his usual alert self. A profound weariness settled over Mason, not just physical exhaustion from the previous night's confrontation, but a deeper fatigue. He'd come to Montana seeking peace and solitude after a lifetime of conflict. Yet here he was, once again, in the middle of a fight. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. Moving cautiously to the window, Mason recognized Sarah Thompson's SUV, followed by an unfamiliar black pickup truck. He watched as Sarah emerged from her vehicle, accompanied by a tall, thin man carrying a large medical case. "Dr. Winters, veterinary specialist from Missoula," Sarah explained when Mason opened the door. "I called him last night about Ranger and your raccoon family. He's the best wildlife veterinarian in the state." Dr. Winters was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He examined Ranger first, nodding with satisfaction at the dog's improving condition. The tranquilizer was a standard veterinary formula, though the dose was excessive, he explained. "He's metabolizing it well. Another 12 hours, and he should be back to normal, though I'd recommend limited physical activity for a few days." The raccoon family received a more thorough examination. Dr. Winters carefully cleaned and redressed the mother's leg wound, administered antibiotics, and checked each kit individually. "Remarkable," he murmured as he worked. "She's maintained excellent care of her young despite significant trauma and infection. Most wild animals would have abandoned them under this level of stress." "She had help?" Sarah pointed out, nodding toward Ranger, who was watching the proceedings with intense interest from the cabin doorway. Dr. Winters smiled. "Indeed. An unlikely guardian." He turned to Mason. "Mr. Fletcher, these kits are actually doing quite well, but the mother's injury requires ongoing treatment. The wound is healing, but she'll need regular care for at least another 2 weeks." "What are you suggesting?" Mason asked. "Typically, we'd transfer them to a wildlife rehabilitation center," Dr. Winters explained. "However, moving newborns is always risky, And given the unusual circumstances, particularly the bond that seems to have formed with your dog, I wonder if you'd consider continuing to care for them here. Under my guidance, I could visit regularly to check progress and provide necessary treatment." Mason glanced at Ranger, who had barely left the raccoon family's side since regaining consciousness. "The decision wasn't really a decision at all. They can stay," he said simply. After Dr. Winters and Sarah departed, with arrangements made for the doctor to return in 2 days, Mason found himself alone with his thoughts again. The cabin seemed unnaturally quiet, the events of the past few days settling around him like the snow outside. He built a fire in the wood stove, then retrieved a worn leather photo album from the bookshelf. It had been months since he'd allowed himself to look at these images. Eleanor smiled up at him from the pages. Eleanor in their garden in Virginia. Eleanor teaching her biology students. Eleanor on their wedding day 37 years ago. Her absence remained a physical ache even after 5 years. "Got myself into another mess. Ellie," he murmured to the photographs, "trying to do the right thing, just like you always did." As afternoon faded into evening, Mason's phone rang again. This time it was Sarah, her voice tense. "Mason, are you home? Is anyone with you?" "Just Ranger and our raccoon guest. Why, we've received some concerning information from Wade Simmons during further questioning. The Blackwells apparently have another partner. We weren't aware of someone local who may have a grudge against you specifically for disrupting their operation." Mason straightened, instantly alert. "Any names mentioned?" "Nothing concrete yet, but as a precaution, I'm sending a deputy to your property. He should be there within the hour. In the meantime, I'd advise staying alert and keeping your doors locked." Mason thanked her and hung up, immediately moving to check that all windows and doors were secured. Ranger seemed to sense the tension, rising to his feet despite his lingering unsteadiness. The dog moved methodically from window to window, sniffing and listening with focused intensity. As darkness fell, Mason positioned himself in the living room where he could observe both the front approach and the back of the property. The Beretta lay within easy reach on the side table. Years of combat had taught him the value of preparation and vigilance, though he hoped such measures would prove unnecessary. The deputy arrived as promised, introducing himself as Officer Daniels, a young man with a serious demeanor who positioned his patrol car strategically at the entrance to Mason's driveway. His presence provided some reassurance, though Mason remained on edge. Around 9 o'clock, Ranger suddenly raised his head from where he'd been resting near the raccoon shelter, his ears forward and alert. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Mason immediately killed the lights in the cabin and moved to the window, scanning the property. At first, he saw nothing unusual in the moonlit landscape. Then, a movement at the tree line caught his eye, a shadow moving where no shadow should be. Mason reached for his phone to alert Officer Daniels when the night exploded into chaos. The sound of breaking glass came from the back of the cabin, followed by the unmistakable whoosh of accelerant igniting. Almost simultaneously, gunshots rang out from the direction of the driveway. "Fire!" Mason yelled into the phone as he grabbed the Beretta and moved toward the back door. Smoke was already filling the kitchen, flames licking up the curtains with unnatural speed. Someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail or something similar through the window. Ranger was barking frantically, not at the fire but at the raccoon shelter. Mason understood immediately they were trapped between the flames and whoever was outside. But the animals couldn't be abandoned. With one arm shielding his face from the heat, Mason grabbed the fire extinguisher from beside the refrigerator and blasted the flames nearest the door. It created a momentary path through the fire, enough for him to reach the back exit. "Ranger, come!" he commanded, throwing open the door. The dog hesitated, clearly torn between following Mason and protecting the raccoons. "Now, soldier." The military command in Mason's voice penetrated Ranger's indecision. The dog bounded through the door, immediately taking up a protective position beside Mason as they hurried to the raccoon shelter. More gunshots sounded from the front of the property. Officer Daniels was returning fire at an unseen assailant, calling for backup on his radio. Mason knew they had precious little time before the fire spread or their attackers converged on their position. The raccoon mother was agitated, sensing the danger. Mason made a split-second decision, grabbing the entire nesting box with mother and kits inside and placing it in a large canvas bag he'd been using to carry supplies. The mother hissed, but didn't bite, seemingly understanding that this rough handling was necessary. "We've got to move," Mason told Ranger, slinging the bag carefully over his shoulder. "Find cover. Go." They moved away from the burning cabin toward the workshop, using the darkness and smoke for concealment. Mason's military training took over, guiding him to think in terms of tactical advantage rather than panic. The workshop offered better protection than the open yard. Plus, it contained tools and his truck keys. They had almost reached the building when a figure emerged from around the corner, silhouetted against the glow of the burning cabin. Robert Blackwell stood blocking their path, a hunting rifle aimed directly at Mason. "Should have minded your own business." "Fletcher," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Now look what you made us do." Mason shifted slightly, positioning himself between Blackwell and the bag containing the raccoons. "Burning down my home. Shooting at a police officer that's a long way from illegal trapping. Blackwell, you've crossed a line you can't come back from." "Too late for turning back," Blackwell replied. "This operation's worth millions. We've got buyers in 3 countries waiting on shipments. Can't let one self-righteous old soldier and his mutt bring it all down." As they faced off, Mason was acutely aware of Ranger tensing beside him, ready to launch himself at Blackwell despite his weakened condition. Any sudden movement would likely result in Blackwell firing, and at this range, he wouldn't miss. "The police already know everything," Mason said, trying to buy time. "Wade told them about the international connections, the buyers, everything. You're finished whether I'm in the picture or not." Doubt flickered across Blackwell's face, quickly replaced by resolve. "Wade doesn't know half of what's really going on, and dead men can't testify about what they've seen." He raised the rifle slightly. Taking careful aim, Mason calculated his options, all of them bad. He couldn't reach his Beretta fast enough, couldn't dodge a bullet at this range, couldn't protect both Ranger and the raccoons. In that frozen moment of decision, something unexpected happened. A shadow detached itself from the darkness behind Blackwell, a small, quick-moving form that launched itself at the man's legs. The raccoon mother, having somehow escaped from the canvas bag, sank her teeth into Blackwell's calf. Blackwell yelled in pain and surprise, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as he staggered backward. It was all the opening Ranger needed. Despite his weakened state, the German shepherd lunged forward, knocking Blackwell to the ground. The rifle skittered away across the snow. Mason moved quickly, drawing the Beretta and training it on Blackwell, who was cursing and trying to fend off both Ranger and the surprisingly fierce raccoon. "Don't move," Mason commanded. "Ranger, hold." The dog immediately shifted to a restraining position, pinning Blackwell with his weight while maintaining a threatening growl. The raccoon mother scurried back toward Mason, seemingly seeking the safety of the canvas bag where her kits remained. In the distance, sirens wailed as backup responded to Officer Daniels' call. The deputy himself appeared from around the burning cabin, weapon drawn, having apparently driven off the other attacker. "Officer Daniels," Mason called out. "Over here. I've got Robert Blackwell." As the deputy approached, Mason became aware of a stabbing pain in his side. Looking down, he was surprised to see a dark stain spreading across his shirt blood. In the chaos and adrenaline, he hadn't noticed that one of Blackwell's wild shots had grazed him. The realization seemed to trigger the pain receptors that shock had been suppressing. Mason staggered slightly, leaning against the workshop wall for support. Ranger immediately left his position guarding Blackwell to press against Mason's leg, whining with concern. "I'm all right, boy," Mason assured him, though the room had begun to spin alarmingly. "Just a scratch." Officer Daniels secured Blackwell with handcuffs, then turned his attention to Mason. "Sir, you're injured. We need to get you medical attention." Mason nodded vaguely, sliding down the wall to sit in the snow. The canvas bag with the raccoon kits lay beside him, the mother having already returned to her babies. Ranger pressed close, his warm body providing comfort as Mason's vision began to blur around the edges. The last thing Mason remembered before losing consciousness was the raccoon mother's dark eyes watching him from within the canvas bag, intelligent, wild, and somehow understanding. In that moment, a connection formed between them, fellow protectors who had each risked everything for those under their care. As darkness claimed him, Mason thought he heard Eleanor's voice, soft and reassuring. "You did good, love. You did real good." Mason woke to the steady beep of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell that brought back unwelcome memories of his recovery after Afghanistan. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was back there, until he felt a familiar weight against his leg and looked down to see Ranger's head resting on the edge of the bed. "There he is," said a warm female voice. Sarah Thompson sat in a vinyl chair by the window, closing a file folder as Mason's eyes focused on her. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Fletcher." "How long?" Mason's voice was rough from disuse. "2 days," Sarah replied, pouring water from a plastic pitcher and helping him take a sip. "The bullet did more damage than it appeared. Nicked an artery. You lost a lot of blood before they got you stabilized." Mason's hand immediately went to his side, feeling the thick bandages beneath the hospital gown. "The raccoons?" he asked. "Priorities clear despite his condition." Sarah smiled. "Safe and sound. Doctor Winters took them to his facility temporarily. The mother needed surgery to properly repair her leg, but she's recovering well. The kits are thriving." Relief washed over Mason, followed immediately by another concern. "My cabin." Sarah's expression sobered. "I'm sorry. Mason, the fire department couldn't get there in time given your remote location. The main structure is gone, though the workshop survived with minimal damage." Mason absorbed this news with a stoic nod. The cabin had been important to him, but it was just a structure. What mattered was that no lives had been lost, human or animal. "The Blackwells?" he asked. "Roberts in custody, charged with attempted murder, arson, assault on a police officer, and a host of wildlife trafficking violations." Sarah reported. "Tim turned himself in yesterday, claiming he didn't know about the attack on your property. He's cooperating in exchange for reduced charges." Mason processed this information slowly, his mind still foggy from medication. "Wade mentioned connections. How far does this go?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at the closed door before answering in a lowered voice. "Further than anyone expected. The wildlife trafficking operation was just the visible part. They were using it as cover for moving other contraband across the border, drugs, primarily. The FBI has taken over that aspect of the investigation." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "You stumbled onto something much bigger than illegal trapping. Mason. If Ranger hadn't found that injured raccoon, if you hadn't cared enough to investigate, who knows how long it would have continued." The door opened, and a doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked dark hair and efficient movements. "Good to see you awake, Mr. Fletcher. I'm Dr. Reeves. How's the pain level? Scale of 1 to 10. 4, Mason replied automatically, a response conditioned by years of military stoicism. Dr. Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Which means about 7 for a normal person. I'll adjust your medication." After checking his vitals and examining the wound, Dr. Reeves updated him on his condition. "The surgery went well. You'll need physical therapy, and I'm recommending at least 4 weeks of restricted activity. No heavy lifting, no strenuous exercise." "When can I go home?" Mason asked, then remembered with a pang that he no longer had a home to return to. "We'll keep you another day for observation, then release you if all remains stable," Dr. Reeves replied. "Do you have somewhere to stay during your recovery?" Before Mason could answer, Sarah interjected. "That's been arranged. My brother has a guest cabin on his property he uses for hunting season. It's yours for as long as you need it." Mason started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "It's already decided. The community took a vote at an emergency town meeting yesterday. You're staying in Frank's cabin until yours can be rebuilt." "Rebuilt?" Mason echoed, confused. Sarah's expression softened. "Mason, while you've been recovering, something remarkable has happened. The story of what you and Ranger did protecting those raccoons, uncovering the trafficking operation, standing up to the Blackwells, it's brought the town together in a way I haven't seen before. People are ashamed they didn't see what was happening, and grateful you had the courage to act." She handed him her phone, opened to a social media page titled "Rebuild for the Ranger." Photos showed dozens of community members gathering supplies, planning construction, and raising funds. "Ben Reynolds is heading the construction committee," Sarah continued, referring to the same man who had called Mason an outsider at the town meeting. "Said he was dead wrong about you and wants to make it right. They're drawing up plans based on your original cabin, but with improvements for accessibility while you recover." Mason stared at the phone, momentarily speechless. After years of isolation, of deliberately keeping the world at arm's length, the idea of accepting such help felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. Yet there was something undeniably healing in the gesture. "What about Ranger while I'm stuck here?" he asked, deflecting from the emotion rising in his chest. "He's officially a therapy dog, now temporary credentials," Sarah explained with a smile. "The hospital administrator made an exception after hearing what he did. He's only allowed in during visiting hours, though," as if understanding he was being discussed. Ranger lifted his head and placed his chin on the edge of Mason's bed, soulful eyes fixed on his human companion's face. "Good soldier," Mason murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Over the next 24 hours, Mason was surprised by a steady stream of visitors. Sheriff Parker brought updates on the investigation. Dr. Winters arrived with photos of the raccoon family's progress. Even Mayor Harkins stopped by, apologizing for not taking the wildlife concern seriously sooner and promising municipal support for rebuilding Mason's cabin. Most unexpected was the arrival of a group of elementary school children, chaperoned by their teacher, bearing hand-drawn get-well cards not just for Mason, but for Ranger as well. They had apparently been learning about wildlife conservation when the story broke, and their teacher had used it as a real-world example of stewardship in action. "Mr. Fletcher," one small girl asked earnestly, "will the baby raccoons come back to visit when they're better?" The question caught Mason off guard. He'd assumed the raccoons would be released back into the wild once fully recovered, returning to their natural existence. The thought of never seeing them again, particularly the mother who had shown such courage, left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. "I don't know, sweetheart," he answered honestly. "Wild animals belong in the wild, but sometimes they remember those who helped them." The day Mason was discharged from the hospital dawned clear and bright, the first hints of spring softening the Montana landscape. Sarah arrived to drive him to the guest cabin, Ranger sitting proudly in the back seat of her SUV. As they pulled away from the hospital, Mason found himself looking forward rather than back, a subtle but significant shift in perspective. The cabin he'd built as a retreat from the world had burned. But from those ashes, something unexpected was emerging: community, purpose, connection. The guest cabin proved to be a comfortable one-bedroom structure on the shores of a small lake, surrounded by pine trees and equipped with basic amenities. Sarah helped Mason settle in, showing him where everything was located and making sure he had all necessary medications and supplies. "Dr. Winters asked if you'd like to visit the raccoons tomorrow," she mentioned as she prepared to leave. "They're at his facility about 20 minutes from here. The mother's recovery is ahead of schedule." Mason nodded, surprised by how much he wanted to see them. "I'd like that." After Sarah departed, Mason sat on the small porch with Ranger at his feet, watching the afternoon sun sparkle on the lake's surface. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. Instead, it felt like a pause, a breath between sentences in a story that was still unfolding. "Never expected any of this, did we, boy?" he said to Ranger, who thumped his tail in agreement. In the distance, a family of ducks glided across the lake, the mother leading her ducklings in a perfect V formation. Mason watched them, thinking about protection, survival, and the unexpected bonds that form in moments of crisis. Perhaps Eleanor had been right all along. Everything truly was connected, in ways more profound than he had ever understood. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the water, Mason Fletcher felt something he hadn't experienced since losing Eleanor: a sense of rightness, of being exactly where he needed to be, not hiding from life, but engaging with it fully, with all its pain and beauty. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be physical therapy, the cabin rebuilding, testimony at the Blackwell's trial. But for the first time in 5 years, Mason was looking forward to tomorrow, and all because a loyal dog had chosen to sleep in the snow. In our twilight years, we often believe our greatest contributions lie behind us. Mason Fletcher thought his purpose had ended with military service and his wife's passing, retreating to solitude where the world couldn't touch him. But life had other plans. When his faithful German shepherd chose discomfort to protect vulnerable creatures, Mason discovered that courage doesn't diminish with age, it transforms. His stand against injustice wasn't just about saving wildlife, it was about reclaiming his place in a community he'd abandoned. Many of us understand this journey. We've built walls after loss, convinced ourselves that isolation is safer than connection. Yet Mason's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters may still await us. Our experience, wisdom, and quiet determination remain powerful forces for good. We may move slower, our joints may ache with changing weather, but our capacity to care, to stand between innocence and harm, never diminishes. Like Mason, we can still be guardians, mentors, and heroes in unexpected ways. The wisdom of our years isn't meant to be hidden away, but shared. Sometimes all it takes is noticing what others ignore: a dog sleeping in the snow, protecting those who cannot protect themselves.